Hereby I open this academic ceremony in which Frauke Stehr will defend the academic thesis Externalities, Impact Beliefs and Behavior in Markets. May I invite you to present the summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis. The floor is yours.
Dear Prorector, dear committee, dear family, friends and colleagues. In the next 15 minutes I would like to summarize to you what I've been working on in the last couple of years. And because the title is not very self-explanatory and not everybody in the audience is an economist, let me start by giving you a simple example for what I think holds together the papers in the thesis. So economics is the science of choices and trade-offs. Here we have Bob, who's considering to get something for dessert. On the one hand, he can get some ice cream for €1.20, or he could get a cupcake for €1.90. Now, if Bob was to decide only based on prices, then he would go for the ice cream because it's 7 cents cheaper. However, in terms of taste, Bob actually prefers the cupcake. And so this confronts him with a trade-off between the monetary dimension on the one hand and other characteristics of the goods in terms of taste, for example, that makes it more complicated for him to choose. And this is what, to me, binds together the papers in the thesis. So all papers are about choices where consumers care about more than just the price of a good. In particular, I have 2 experiments where I, in the first experiment, have a project on consumer behavior when choices also affect other people. So this is what we call externalities in economics. In a second experiment, I also look at the scenario where behavior affects other people, but there I focus not only on their behavior, but also how they think about how their choices affect other people, and so what their impact is on these other people. And then finally, in the third paper, I take a step back and look at how firms might strategically respond to this when consumers have preferences not only for the price, but also for some other product dimension, for example, in their choice of the product portfolio. Let me start by explaining to you Chapter 2, an experiment on voluntary compensation behavior. So we again have Bob, who is this time considering to go on a vacation, taking a plane to Bali because he's working for 5 years on his thesis and really needs some vacation. He would enjoy very much lying on the beach, and this would give him a high utility. At the same time, he also knows that flying produces a large environmental externality and hence also affects other people. So what we are after in this paper is to look at a scenario where exactly people are confronted with this choice. They can either take a choice that yields them a personal benefit, but also creates a negative externality, or decide to abstain from that choice. And in the second step, we are then looking at whether people are willing to pay money out of their own pocket to reduce the externality. So in this case, to reduce the pollution that is created. Then we also look at how this willingness to compensate depends on the tangibility of the externality. So in particular, if you think about environmental externalities, one characteristic that comes to mind is that they are usually not focused on one particular person. But the harm of the externality is diffused among many people. So this is one setting that we look at. And also, especially salient in the case of a plane, you're usually not the only one who's on the plane, so responsibility in creating the externality is diffused among many people. In the paper, we run a laboratory experiment where subjects can take the role of either buyers, so Bob, or harmed parties. And whenever a buyer buys a product, they get some personal benefit, modeling kind of the benefit of being on vacation, for example. But they also create a negative externality on a harmed subject, that's another person in the lab. We then run a couple of different treatments to identify the effects of the availability of this compensation technology and also the different dimensions of the externality, so the tangibility. Let me summarize to you the main results of this paper. The first result is that people are on average willing to offset their externalities, but net externalities still remain on a high level at around 70% of the original externality. And second, when we look at the effect of diffusion, diffusion of responsibility seems to lower the amount that people give to compensation, not necessarily their willingness to compensate per se. However, this still leads to larger net externalities compared to the situation where we don't have any diffusion. Let me move on by explaining to you Chapter 3, Dodging High Impact Behavior with Motivated Beliefs. Here we again have a setting where, for example, Bob wants to do something good for the environment. And he can think of different options. For example, he might recycle or he might reduce his meat consumption. Now, recycling is relatively easy, and hence we would model, as economists, we would model this as low-cost action, but the environmental benefit of recycling is also relatively low. At the same time, reducing or completely stopping consuming meat would create a large environmental benefit, but it's also much more cumbersome or costly, as we would say as economists, because, for example, changing habits of nutrition is a very difficult thing. Now, the question is, how would people solve this trade-off between higher impact on the one hand, but also higher costs? And what we see in the data is that people typically tend to do the cheaper action, which could be just explained by the fact that it's cheaper, it's easier for them to do. But we also sometimes hear people say, you know, I don't have to change my meat consumption because I'm already doing enough because I'm recycling. And so what I look at in this paper is how people conceptualize the impact that their choices have, for example, in terms of environment. And so in particular, because of this kind of cost structure, I hypothesize that people might have motivated beliefs. So they might form impact beliefs after the fact of their choices, so just as a justification for their choice, in a particular way. They might want to underestimate the high impact level of a costly action, because this is costly, so they don't want to do it. So it's easier to justify why you're not doing it by underestimating the impact. And at the same time, you want to do the cheap action to feel good about yourself, and so you might have an incentive to overestimate the impact of this cheap action, to make the two more similar to you, and to make it a concise narrative of why you're doing enough by already doing recycling. In the paper, I run an online experiment where subjects can donate to so-called projects, which vary in their impact and price. Prices are always perfectly known when people have to donate, but the impact has to be estimated. Then again, I run a couple of different treatments to try to isolate this kind of motivated part of the belief formation process. In particular, I vary whether they get paid a lot to tell me their accurate belief or not, and I change the order of elicitation. So if you think about the real world where people might tell you, but recycling is already doing a lot for the environment, then this might be because they rationalize their choice. So they have decided to do the recycling because it's the cheap thing. And then to come up with an explanation, afterwards they change their belief and say, it's doing a lot, instead of having this kind of biased belief ex ante before taking their choices of the action. So what I do in the experiment is I change the order of elicitation. In one treatment, I first elicit beliefs and then have people decide on their donation. In the other treatment, I first have people decide on their donation and afterwards elicit their beliefs to give them more wiggle room to adapt their beliefs to their choices. What do I find? The main result is that people, in line with evidence from the field literature also, people overestimate small impact levels and underestimate high impact levels. However, across all the different manipulations that I run, this does not seem to be driven by motivated reasoning. So this biased belief pattern is robust to many different changes in the environment. The second result comes to the effect of this kind of order change in the elicitation. and it's that making subjects think about the impact before donating, by asking about their belief before donating, makes it more likely that they maximize their impacts by actually donating to multiple projects. In the last 5 minutes, let me tell you about the third project of my thesis, which is the theoretical model called a price and location model. So there we take a step back and look at how do firms respond to this kind of consumer behavior where consumers care about more than just the price. So what's the setting? We again have Bob. He has traveled to Bali and he wants to get some ice cream. He's on a beach and he wants to get some ice cream, preferably at the lowest price, but also he's lazy, so he does not want to walk very far. And then what we look at is two firms who want to sell their ice cream to Bob. And these firms first pick prices, and then in a second stage, when observing each other's prices, they decide where to locate on this beach. The important part here is that they don't know, they cannot observe where exactly Bob is located, and so they think Bob might be at all the points on the beach with equal probability. The contribution that we make is that we look at the asymmetric case, so where one firm has an advantage in terms of production cost. So they have lower production costs, which means that they are more competitive in terms of prices, so they can outperform the other company more easily because they have lower costs. And what we look at is how this affects their choices in terms of their location on this beach. The main result is that there's only a mixed strategy equilibrium on this location stage. What does this mean? This means that firms do not deterministically pick one point on this line, but instead pick multiple points, and each of these with a certain probability. In particular, this looks like the following. The strong firm will locate in the middle, because in this way they can capture a lot of the different cases of where Bob is located. So Bob might be located further to the left, Bob might be located further to the right, and in many of these cases, because the stronger firm will be able to post the smaller price, Bob will always go to this firm in the middle. Now, what can the weaker firm do in this case, the one with the higher production cost? They will also mix, but they will mix with equal probability on both sides of this line, on both ends of this line, to be able to capture at least some demand for the rare cases where Bob is located at the very end of the beach. So with this, let me conclude. In the dissertation, Externalities, Impact Beliefs, and Behavior in Markets, I have analyzed how choices are influenced when people care about more than just their price. I used various methods, both experiments, laboratory and online, and theoretical modeling to derive some results of what will happen in this case. In particular, in Chapter 2, I've provided evidence that people are willing to reduce negative externalities, even at their own cost, but that this willingness is affected by characteristics of the externality, in particular diffusion of responsibility in creating the externality. Second, when choices affect others, impact beliefs tend to be biased, but according to the results of my experiment, this does not seem to be driven by motivated reasoning, but rather by some kind of noisy perception or noisy encoding of the impact levels. And then finally, weaker firms, so firms that have a disadvantage in terms of production costs, may actually attract some demand by producing further away from the mainstream, so by locating further to the edges of this kind of hoteling beach. And with this, I would like to conclude and give the word back to the pro-rector.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Dr. Arno Riedel. Professor Riedel was chair of the assessment committee, and he's professor in public economics at this university. The floor goes to Professor Riedel.
Thank you. Dear candidate, dear Frauke, thank you very much for this very clear presentation, but even more so for writing a very nice PhD thesis. It was very nice reading. I liked it a lot. You're covering a number of important topics. I mean, externalities it's an old topic in economics, but there's still many things to ask, and you give kind of a put a different look at it, and was very refreshing. Also looking at the beliefs problems was very nice. And what is also would like to emphasize is that you're having shown your skills not only in experimental work but also in theoretical work. So I think that's not the case in many PhD theses nowadays. I think that's worthwhile to mention. So congratulations with that. But as always, then it comes to the sentence. I'm here to ask a question, at least one question, and so if possible, a critical question. So we'll try to do that. I have a question about chapter 2, or my first question is about chapter 2, about the compensation behavior. And there you introduce a concept that you call compensation preferences. I've never seen this before in the literature. Maybe it's just my ignorance of the literature, that could be. So, but please then just let me know and clarify this. But I was wondering why you did this, right? So there are so many, because what this chapter is about kind of social behavior, right? Do you take into account the well-being or the damage or the disutility of others? And there are many models on the market from this. On this issue, I mean, there are models of warm glow, of altruism, of inequality aversion, of with and without reciprocal, and intention-based. And I mean, I don't have to tell you, right? So, and because I don't have to tell you, I'm even more surprised. Right? So I would like to know two things. So why did you use this? And I mean, you're also not very clear, at least in my view, not very clearly defining what you mean with it, right? So. And I was wondering whether, for instance, you could not have used, also for instance, the diffusion question, right? Whether you could not have used just an existing model and use this to make predictions. Maybe you've tried it and you say, yeah, all these models predict the same. I don't know. But yeah, I would just like to know from you, why did you use this compensation preferences? A little bit what you more precisely mean with it, and how this differs from social preferences more generally, and why you did not use the models that are on the market to make predictions for your model.
Highly esteemed opponent, first of all, thank you very much for your kind words, and also thank you for the interesting question. So the question is whether we use this term compensation preference a lot in the paper, and whether this is actually a genuine preference that's separate from other kind of other regarding preferences. And my honest answer would be, I don't think it's different. I think if anything, it's probably not, it's a bit sloppy writing maybe, so we should be more careful with this. And the way I would think about this is more as a kind of model where people have some kind of moral cost of creating a negative externality. This is what we use to predict, to derive our predictions, and this kind of moral cost function might be affected by the diffusion then. But to give one explanation of why we use this phrasing is that there's also literature out there that shows that beyond kind of outcome-based preferences, people also sometimes have procedural preferences about how other regarding outcomes come about. So to give you one example, there is a paper by Jakob et al. That looks at whether people are willing to, people have to create some kind of pollution in the lab. They have to throw chickpeas at a small bin that is far away, and of course they will not hit the bin. And so there's a lot of dirt around. And so they look at whether people are willing to clean up their own mess by themselves, or whether they are willing to delegate this to somebody else who could do it for a way cheaper price. And so this kind of establishes the fact of a genuine preference because they are willing to do this even though it is costly and inefficient. And what they show is that a lot of people have exactly this kind of procedural preference. So in that sense, to clean up the chickpeas that they themselves produced. And so I do think that especially in the case of environmental externalities, there is also a role for other procedural preferences. And so I think compensation preference in and of itself is not necessarily the worst wording.
May I? Briefly? No, I agree, but I mean, you throw another existing concept now, you know, on the board, on the table or on the desk, which is procedural preference. My question again would be, right? Why didn't you use this concept, right? Also because what I miss a little bit also in this chapter is that you're a little bit hand waving about the hypothesis and the predictions, right? So. Because you write, for instance, the collective harm reduces the identifiability of victims and hence may lead to compassion fade. Okay, but I can come up with models, you know, if you have more people affected, that might actually lead to the opposite prediction, right? Because more people are affected. So, and if I have, let's say, a model of where I dislike to impose disutility on others, that actually would tell me, you know, I should have a stronger effect if more people are more affected. So, and I have the idea that you're bringing many of these concepts without, you know, working it out precisely. And I mean, so was there a particular reason why you did not use a formal model and just, you know, try to write down the predictions very clearly, or is it too complicated to do? I don't know. It's just a question I would like to have answered.
I think so. Let me explain to you how we came up with the hypotheses, and this was very much driven by results that from the literature, so what we observe from the literature. So there are models out there. There is a paper in RISA that looks at how kind of the number of people affected, how this affects your choices, for example. And they also show that there is this kind of scope neglect, so that people don't tend to be sensitive to kind of the sum of their impacts. So people tend not to be perfectly utilitarian. And similarly, there is, of course, also literature on the diffuse responsibility part, where this is mostly modeled as driven by beliefs about pivotality. But because there are also models out there, we thought that there's not a lot of added benefit to write down a model for this particular setting, because it would be relatively straightforward to apply to our setting in terms of deriving the hypotheses. That this would end up in that way is not straightforward. After all, this is why we do experiments. But we thought the added benefit would not be that great.
Thank you very much.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Jeannette Brozig-Koch. She is online. She was a member of the assessment committee, and she is a professor in behavioral social policy at the Otto von Guericke Universiteit Magdeburg. The floor goes to Professor Brozig-Koch.
Thank you very much. And also from my side, thank you very much for your very nice summary of your research. And I also have to say, I really enjoyed reading your PhD thesis, but I have to ask a critical question. And my first question also refers to the second chapter of your thesis, in which you present an experiment on voluntary compensation behavior. You motivated your research by referring to voluntary carbon emission offsetting tools. And I would like to ask you to elaborate in more detail how this specific example refers to your experimental design, in which you investigate buyers who stay unaffected by the externality they cause. Yeah. So this is the first part. The second part is, can you provide examples for real-world decision situations that your design could probably better represent?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words. Could I ask you maybe to clarify the second part of the question? So what would it represent better than? Sorry.
Better maybe than these carbon emission offsetting tools. I mean, these are an example for your study. And so my first part is that you discuss, so how can you really apply this specific example to your specific research design, experiment design. And given that buyers are not affected by the externality in your experimental design. And the second thing is, could you provide more examples, so real-world examples that your design could represent?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the clarification. So to answer your first question, which is about why did we decide for the experimental design where the buyer itself is not affected by the externality. The reason why we picked this is because to some extent we see this kind of, we wanted to not get it confounded with self-interest. And you can also think about the real-world setting where the impact of the externalities, of the carbon externalities, is actually not equally distributed across humanity. So people in the global south in Africa tend to be much more affected than people in the global north like us, both because the climate effects are stronger and also because they lack the infrastructure to kind of adjust to this. So one could argue that this is maybe like a more extreme version of this, what we are doing here, where the buyers are not affected at all. But it's not completely far away from what is happening in the real world. Also, I could maybe address this question of how does this matter to the results a bit by telling you that there's another experiment that also looks at offsetting, and where in the first stage they have a double auction market, in the second stage they have a public goods game. So there the monetary externalities actually affect all of the people in the market, so you yourself are also affected. But their results are relatively similar. So I think if anything, it's a question about how to interpret the effect sizes in the experiment, and probably lab experiments are not the right method to establish effect sizes about field behavior anyway. To answer your second question about is carbon offsetting the only example that we can look at, in principle, of course not. So you can also think of other, in particular, environmental externalities where there is actually also biodiversity offsetting. So this is mostly, for now, done by companies. So when companies build a new industrial site, they might destroy some kind of biodiversity area. And so there's also a kind of credit system that they can, where they can pay some money to establish some other environmental positive externality then to kind of offset the negative impact that they had. So I think it's not only about carbon emissions, but also, in principle, there are also markets available for other environmental externalities.
Thank you. Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Jana Friedrichsen, also online, and who was also a member of the assessment committee, and she is a professor in economics and ethics at Kiel University. The floor goes to Professor Friedrichsen.
Thank you very much for the nice presentation and also for having me as part of the assessment committee. It was my pleasure to read your thesis, and there's a lot of food for thought, and we can certainly discuss for very long, but let me start with one question on chapter 2 here. So you're arguing that introducing the compensation option can increase the frequency of buying, and therefore the effect on the total harm is not clear, because it could either increase if, or it could decrease if people take the compensation option and buying behavior remains unchanged. But it could also lead to an increase in total harm if the frequency in buying increases so much that these reductions are overcompensated. And I'm wondering whether you can elaborate on the characteristics of preferences or additional assumptions that you would need to make to clarify when you would expect to see one or the other.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. So if I understand the question correctly, it's about what kind of modeling assumptions we would need to get more clear-cut predictions about under which circumstances the introduction of compensation technology will lead to larger or smaller net externalities. Is this correct? Okay.
Yes.
Well, of course, there are many different free parameters because we didn't write up a model. So now I can give you a couple of thoughts of what I have would affect this. First of all, and most importantly, I think what affects this in the real world is whether this compensation technology actually works or not. So in our experiment, it works deterministically. So we make sure that whenever you give something to compensation, this will always reduce the externality. And in the real world, this is really not clear because the market is very unregulated. So there's a lot of greenwashing going on. But more specifically in the setting of our experiment, I guess what it depends on is kind of the marginal disutility of creating this harm and the marginal utility of money. So there's probably some kind of internal solution which depends on the specific curvature of the utility function for each individual between the moral costs of creating this externality and the marginal utility you get from the kind of monetary benefit that you have. And so in the model that we have in mind, people would kind of trade this off and come to kind of an internal solution unless the price is so high that they would prefer to not buy.
You can go ahead, Professor Friedrichsen.
Okay, and let me maybe follow up on that answer. So from reading that chapter, it appeared to me as if the moral cost related directly to the harm created. And now if you were thinking of a situation where this is the case, then introducing the compensation option should, with a fully rational agent, not change the amount of harm they choose, right? So I was thinking also with the first question a little bit about whether the problem with increasing harm can only occur if the externality is kind of only sold in bunches with the product. So if you cannot choose continuously how much harm you create. And then that relates to real world situations where usually we can decide how much to consume in many situations, which would more fit a situation where you can choose your externality continuously. So I wonder whether that's a bit of an artificial thought only that arises from the discreteness in your design.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the clarification. Let me explain how we thought probably about the moral cost, which is not, so in terms of temporal distribution of the kind of effects, we were thinking about this as kind of very much outcome-based. So what you care about is kind of the net externality that you create. And so compensation gives you, so what happens in the end, basically, not about the temporal resolution. I first create something and then I can reduce it afterwards, but about the net effect. This is basically what you care about. And in this case, compensation allows you to endogenously reduce the externality akin to the situation that you refer to, where you decide on how much to buy of a particular green or gray product. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The opposition will be continued. By Dr. Elias Tsakas, who was the fourth member of the assessment committee and whose expertise is in economic theory at this university. The floor goes to Elias Tsakas.
So, dear Frauke, dear candidate, I should also probably join the people who spoke before me in congratulating you with what you turned in. It's actually, I would say, quite remarkable and unusual people to cover that broad span within such a short time frame and that early in their career, and that by itself is quite something, and especially, I mean, if you do this at a high level like you did. I would like, I mean, unlike, I mean, the previous candidates, I would like to focus more on chapter 4, I have a couple of questions here, but the first one, I mean, is probably something that that you've discussed. I mean, you've thought about up to now, and it sort of takes as a starting point the overall motivation and the overall reasoning for setting up the model the way you did, and in particular, we can think of many applications where firms first choose the location, which is sort of the more longer-term decision, and then ex post they compete on prices. But I mean, the way you've set up the model, it's basically upside down. So first firms pick prices, and to motivate this, you pick some examples. I mean, which, I mean, one can argue, you know, I mean, are these examples actually general enough? I mean, do they cover, I mean, many different aspects? And in principle, one can say, okay, it's fine. I mean, these are well-defined cases, but then, I mean, the part that I would like to ask about is you go on. I mean, you obtain some results in terms of your equilibrium analysis, but then I'm sort of missing the reflection back to the examples that you have. So I'm basically wondering, I mean, the equilibrium analysis, at least qualitatively, what you get, does it speak to the, I mean, is there something of particular interest with regards to the examples and the overall motivation? So if I look back, what's so special about the examples that, I mean, and the setting that you have in mind, and how does this tie with your results?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and your interesting and relevant also question. So the question is about whether the motivation kind of really fits the model. And the motivation that we give, because in the literature, usually the choice order is done the other way around. So as you said, people first pick locations, and then they compete in prices, because prices are more quick to adjust. And we argue that there are some markets where this is maybe not the case. And in particular, we think of, for example, markets for simple art, where people just post a price for example, a product that you can, a poster where you can get prints, and then they can very easily adjust whatever they will print, but the price is a kind of long-term, more longer-term decision. And the question is whether our equilibrium results kind of reflect this. I would think that there are markets, for example, as we argue in the paper, also the restaurant market, where this is where you could actually argue that this fits. So you have maybe higher brand restaurants which might have a cost advantage. They have, and they tend to produce a more kind of stable menu, especially if you think about lunch menus, whereas you might have cheaper restaurants in terms of the quality, which might have a cost advantage, which then kind of produce towards cater to more kind of obscure tastes, if you will. Whether this is then in the end actually driven by the cost structure, for this I don't know about don't know enough about the restaurant market, to be perfectly honest. To give you a more fair answer as well, though, is that I think the market setting of the hoteling model is not the only application of the hoteling model. So in particular, the hoteling model is nice because it's used in many different literatures. You can use it, it's used in the political science literature, in political economy, where it's about politicians picking platforms. And the motivation that we actually started out with is a contest example, where you think of a designer or an architect submitting some design to a kind of public procurement example. And especially if you think about public procurement, there you would think, okay, people first post their proposals in terms of prices and what they will do. And then in the second stage, they will kind of decide on what exactly they will design. And so this is kind of how we came up with this timing, because this was the motivation that we had in mind first, which is not written down in the paper currently. And there you could maybe think more that this would be appropriate. Also, in terms of political economy, this is not super unusual to look at the case where you have a hoteling model or a spatial competition model where one politician has kind of a head start. People in the political economy literature tend to think about this as, for example, one person is more charismatic or more attractive, and just because of this has a higher probability of being voted for. And so I think our model is able to cater to all these different kinds of cases, and you can pick the motivation that you like best.
Thank you very much. I mean, to actually make it a little bit more concrete, I mean, let me ask, for instance, I mean, in your equilibrium characterization, you find, I mean, that at least when it comes to the location parameter, regardless whether actually you interpret it as a location or as a political position, I mean, there you only get mixed equilibria. So in the kind of examples that you were talking about before, I mean, do we have an interpretation of what mixed equilibria would mean? Is it natural to think that, I mean, in these kind of settings, we see mixed equilibria and not pure ones? So basically, all I'm saying is that, I mean, let's take, I mean, qualitative aspects of the results and bring them back to the examples that we have and see, I mean, do they fit? And this is one instance, the mixing part, for example.
Okay. Esteemed opponent, thanks for the clarification. Yes, I agree. I think at first sight it seems a bit weird to think of individuals playing mixed strategies. I do think that there are two potential answers to this. First is that you could take a kind of population interpretation where ex ante you don't know what kind of strategy or what kind of type your opponent will be, and so that would give you this kind of uncertainty about their strategy. An alternative argument could also be, now you don't know very much about German politics, but for example, there's a German left-wing politician, historically left-wing, who is now also starting to cater a lot to the political right, once in a while, but she's still party member of the left party. So I actually do think that even in the kind of within-person case, people might try to cater to both sides.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Bart Goldstein, who is a professor in human capital and social economics at this university. The floor goes to Professor Goldstein.
Thank you. Dear candidate, dear Frauke, congratulations also on my behalf on finishing this beautiful thesis. I very much enjoyed reading it, and it contains chapters of very high quality. And also I liked your writing style. It's very, very well written. I think your analyses are relevant, novel, very creative, and insightful. I have a question on chapter 2 as well, as some of the other opponents. And so my question is, the analysis is performed in a relatively small laboratory setting. And you mentioned somewhere that, I have to quote, that measuring these preferences for compensation is very difficult in the field. But I wonder how you could do this. Do you have some ideas about how you could measure these preferences in the field to give more, and that's what also some of the other opponents are asking here, to give more, so to discuss more the external validity of your findings. Do you have some ideas about that?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and your question. As an experimentalist, my go-to answer would be to run an experiment. This you can, of course, easily do by, for example, contacting airlines who by now also more frequently offer carbon offsetting by default on their websites. And you could try to see, you could randomize kind of maybe for the frequent flyers. So you have a kind of a sound sample, and you could randomize who of them is offered this compensation option and who of them is not, and then try to see whether this affects their kind of their flying frequency. The reason why we did this in a lab experiment is because the other part, so the diffusion part, this is much more difficult to exogenously plausibly vary. So one would need to think about different settings where one could think that there's plausible exogenous variation in the kind of either responsibility or in kind of the harm created. And I think this is very difficult, and it's much more easy to cleanly do this, fixing beliefs and everything about this in the lab, which is why we decided to do this in the lab to be able to have more control, in particular about this dimension.
All right, thank you very much. Yes.
The opposition will be continued by Dr. Stefan ter Stiege, whose expertise is in microeconomics. The floor goes to Dr. ter Stiege.
Yeah, dear candidate, dear Frauke, let me also first of all congratulate you on this very fine thesis. Like has been said before, it's very remarkable really that you combine both theory and experiments, and I also want to stress it's a really hard theoretical problem that you cover there in your thesis, obviously. So I have one question on this chapter, chapter 4. So one of the, maybe the most striking result is that under certain conditions on the costs of these firms, they actually choose pure strategies or pure pricing strategies. So from the other variant of the model where first the location is chosen and then the price, one insight is that the specification of the cost, not the cost, the transport cost function is very crucial. For example, you cite a paper by Osborne and a co-author that under linear transportation costs you have mixed equilibria, and under concave costs you have pure equilibria. So because it's such an important, or one of the really main results of this chapter, it's a hard question, but so what is, can something be said from based on your analysis that you did, and how far this finding is robust to different specifications of the transportation costs? So what key features, or how does it play a role that can one say something about this, that the cost function is linear, and how would this analysis then change if it were concave?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your difficult question. So the question is, how much of this is driven by the assumption that we have linear transportation costs, and because in particular in the literature with the other timing, usually people assume quadratic transportation costs. Or more generally in the Osborne paper, they just look at concavity. My honest answer about how this plays out on the pricing stage is, I don't know, I would have to think about this with more time. What I would like to mention, though, is that these kind of transportation costs are about behavior on the hoteling stage. So this is in particular about whether we get some kind of pure location equilibrium. And this is difficult because there are these discontinuities in the demand and profit functions if you have linear production costs. This is not necessarily the problem in our case because of the opposite timing. But so because the transportation cost is going on the second stage, I would really have to take more time to think about how this would affect the pure strategy equilibrium in the first stage then.
Yeah, have you ever considered this concave or quadratic cost case also? Did you, or for what reason, or was there a specific reason that you started with and focused on the linear case?
We started with the linear case because we came from this contest model that we had in mind and were completely ignorant of the hoteling literature, to be honest. But at least what we tested is whether the quadratic cost assumption would help us a lot in terms of being able to determine the full equilibrium. Because as you said, as you will have read, is that we're not able to determine the full equilibrium. So what I've shown to you in the presentation, this equilibrium description, only holds for a certain parameter space, and for smaller advantages we cannot say something. What we can say is that the quadratic costs will not help us there, at least. I would have to think more about how this would play out in the rest.
Good, thank you very much.
Thank you. This concludes the first round. It gives us an opportunity to start the second round, and it's a custom at this university that in the second round those who are further away and not from Maastricht University get the floor first. So I'm happy to give the floor to Professor Brozig-Koch if she would like to enter in the discussion once again.
My second question is more related to the choice of design details, so the designs of your experiment. Let's refer again to your second chapter, your experiment on voluntary compensation behavior. I read the instructions and I figured out that in the main part of the experiment, you use two illustrative examples to explain the decision task. And I have two questions with regard to this design choice. The first is, why did you choose these specific numbers? And what are the shortcomings of providing specific numbers or using illustrative examples in economic experiments?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. Yes, we thought a lot about whether and how to provide examples. The trade-off one faces as an experimenter is, do you tell people too much about how to behave, and do you affect them in some way by picking a specific example? In particular, also, I guess this is what you're referring to by mentioning the specific numbers. There could be some kind of anchoring effect of the numbers that we pick that make people kind of choose options that are closer to the numbers that we give them in the examples. Now, what we tried in our instructions to kind of combat this is to give them many different examples, to at least make it not very salient what the one particular kind of focal point and hence anchor would be. And so we try to provide them with examples for all the different contingencies, so for where they compensate, where they don't compensate, and how this affects payoffs of all the involved parties, and in the responsibility cases also how the different contingencies of one person deciding, the other person deciding, both deciding the same, to make sure that there is not one particular very salient scenario that would potentially drive people's answers.
But you choose specific numbers, and a related question is, do you observe such anchoring effects in your experiment? So did you test for this? Did you control for this?
No, we have not looked at this, and I would have to look at the numbers particularly. I can have a look to see whether I can at least have a hunch for this. I mean, the price is randomly varied anyway, so the question is only about the compensation amount.
Instructions part 2.
This is.
So there are two illustrative examples. The second page. I mean,
yes.
It doesn't matter the specific number, but I just want to say whether you controlled for this.
The instructions for part 2. Part 2 is the case in the experiment where people only have the buying decision. And so there I would not expect an effect of anchoring in the sense that the outcome variable is a binary variable, do they buy or not buy? And the numbers here refer to the prices, which are randomly varied in the experiment anyway. So I would not know how to observe a kind of direct anchoring to this specific number of the price. If anything, this could be happening in the second part, which is called part 3 here. There we have full compensation, no compensation, and 10 points as compensation. Okay, I think from remembering the histograms, I don't think that there's a lot of mass at this exact point of 10 compensation points given. But I would have to look more into this, and I will gladly do so. Thanks for the comment.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Friedrichsen if she would like to have a second opportunity. Professor Friedrichsen.
Yes, I would have a question on also a design issue or a very big question to chapter 3, where you have this guessing task with particular symbols, where participants overestimate small amounts and underestimate large amounts. And I was wondering whether you have evidence from a similar task in a setting where there's no reason for motivated belief. So something where participants would just be incentivized to guess correctly. And I would be interested in hearing how the numbers would look like there.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. Yes, I have good news for you. In the meantime, since submitting the thesis, I have run this exact treatment. So a treatment where people do not have a donation choice at all. So in that sense, there's no intrinsic incentive to form any motivated belief. And so they just have kind of the estimation task at hand. It's still framed in the context of the donations to make it similar to the rest. But so by this we could see, do people infer, for example, about the impact level from prices or not? And importantly, is this really motivated or not? And what I can tell you is that beliefs are exactly the same as in all the other settings. So the fact that they do have a donation choice does not seem to affect this kind of over and underestimation.
Thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Riedel.
Thank you very much. Looking at the clock, it's most likely the last question. So therefore, I was planning to ask something about chapter 3, but there was one question, and I will ask Dr. Zakas whether he would allow me to ask the question on the proposition, because the whole committee was intrigued about the proposition and would like to know the answer. So I thought I'd take this opportunity. It's about proposition 6, and I would like to ask one of the paranymphs to read out loud the proposition.
Even within economics, subdisciplines are held to very different standards of scientific conduct.
We're very curious to hear your answer.
Dear committee, I guess this was a question by everyone. Thank you for your question, and let me elaborate what I think about this, or why I came up with this. So I'm, of course, an experimentalist, but also a theorist. And so I observe also the methodology that people use in theory, where this might also be fine, where people kind of have a hunch of what might be going on, and then they try to find a specification that, that actually leads to this equilibrium. And within theory, this may be an appropriate thing, but of course, I also have a lot of friends that actually work in applied fields, are also economists, but work, for example, in development or so. And what we've seen in the last couple of years is that especially experiments, there's a lot of focus. There has been the replicability crisis, so there's demands on pre-registering hypotheses, pre-registering outlier treatment, and so on. But especially when we look at other applied fields, I think there's none of this debate. And in particular, what I always found striking is that there's no debate about how the data cleaning is done, which is a huge step in any kind of applied setting. And because we as experimentalists do control the data generating process, we don't have to do data cleaning usually. And so this is kind of easily ignored by experimentalists. But in the field, when you have kind of dirty survey data, you actually need to treat data a lot. And there's no discussion about how this should be done and how this should be registered. So I think this is remarkable.
You may briefly conclude your reaction.
I was finished.
Frauke Stehr, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed, and the degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And I request that you and your company await results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. All your time, 'cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Hit the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. Even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Can't fly by now, don't waste all your time, 'cause I'll go the extra mile.
shouting at each other.
Okay, well, that's...
So what happens now? I get the thing and then I immediately hand it over to you.
We decided we
That's maybe...
Okay.
So I guess that's the most likely scenario, but I'm not entirely sure about the procedure, so we kind of do need to make a talk about
We can accept it both of us together. A joint effort.
Should we stand, do you think? Or should we sit?
You. Up to you.
Yeah. Okay, I'll copy it.
No, I need my hands free.
Ah, yes, you need your hands free. You had to read a proposition.
Yes, my moment to shine.
Yes.
You could have taken longer, then Frauke wouldn't have time to answer.
Yeah, sorry.
My sister remarked to me that I actually should have taken this as an opportunity to snark in a comment about Francesca Gino. Did you hear about this? So, you know her, this HBS professor, right? The Italian one. She's a psychologist, behavioral economist, co-author of Dan Ariely. And she also faked data, and like, not fake data, but manipulated data to get significant results by moving people from the control to the treatment group. Amazing. And so this would have been perfect opportunity to do this.
Frauke Stehr, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense, and in view of its positive verdict, and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Dr. Werner is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom, and I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent and responsible?
I promise.
Please use the microphone.
You have to turn it on.
The hand microphone to right, yes.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principle of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent and responsible?
I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confirm upon you, Frauke Anna Stehr, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with a degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. So Christian and I are now allowed to say a few words. So dear Frauke, I would like to congratulate you to your PhD, to this great achievement. So this is a great day, and I'm very happy for you that you achieved this milestone, and you have very well deserved it. I remember that when you applied for the position at our department, Christian and I were very clear from the beginning that we wanted to offer the position to you, and then we are very happy that you accepted and became our colleague. And when we had our first conversation about research, it became very clear what the goal of your research was. You wanted to do something in your first project that actually helps to solve problems, in particular environmental and social problems. And you are a person who is very concerned about how to protect the environment and then to foster sustainable consumption. And you really do your part. For instance, if you go to conferences, you take the train rather than flying. So this concern for others and for the environment has been reflected in your research ideas, and this also can be seen in the interesting projects that you have been working on, as you just showed in your presentation. As we all know, a PhD thesis is a long journey and is full of challenges, but you have successfully mastered them all, and you can really be very proud of yourself. One big challenge is to combine different methods in your thesis, and I think few people are willing to take this challenge. So combining both experimental and microeconomic theoretical research is really a tough choice, but you successfully took the hard way, and you combine experimental research and microtheory on a high and convincing level in your thesis. Another challenge was that COVID appeared when you just were preparing your single-author project, but then you showed your flexibility and then shifted everything to online experimentation. It was a new development at that time, and then that enabled you to successfully continue your project. Also, yet another challenge is to work with different supervisors who might have different views on different things, but again, you, with your open personality, you successfully mastered this in the last years. I've experienced you as a very curious person with a critical mind who really thinks very thoroughly about every single aspect of the study, and I think that's really a crucial aspect and a crucial characteristic for a good researcher. And we had many fruitful discussions over the last years, for instance in our joint project, and it was really sometimes hard work for each of us to convince the other that this was the road to take, and I really enjoy these conversations, and I really that they bring our projects forward, and once both are convinced, then we know that this is really the way to go. Another characteristic that should be mentioned is your openness and your willingness to take new challenges. Right, in your career, you have been studying in Germany. You have also did your master's studies in Copenhagen before you then came here, and you also you are always willing to try out something new. You spent research days. First online at the BRIC in Bonn due to COVID, but also at the WZB in Berlin, where you're currently still working, and also at the University of Zurich. And this shows your openness and your willingness to take new challenges. And I think that these stays have provided you with many new perspectives and will inspire you for exciting new research in the future. So you have left here your mark at the department. Everyone who knows Frauke knows that you can always ask her for help, and she will do that. And this cooperative personality and your intrinsic motivation to do something for the group is a very positive trait that will continue to open many doors for you in the future. So soon you will take the next step in your career at the University of Vienna. You will be missed here, but we are sure that we will stay in contact and that we can welcome you back in Maastricht soon. So congratulations again. I wish you a great day to celebrate with your family, with your friends, and with colleagues, and we wish you all the best for the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, Frauke, also from my side, congratulations on finishing this very nice thesis, also on your talk today and also on the defense. So I remember 5 years back we had this Zoom call, and I think already then you saw that we are a little bit different. So I was a little bit unconventional running around with the laptop. I think we both remember this call quite vividly, and I was extremely happy that you accepted our offer when you had also very attractive other opportunities. In the first year, it was a little bit about taming you in some sense, because you had so many different ideas and so you went in so many different directions that we really had to find something which drives you also to pursue these kind of projects over more than a few months, but really to dig deeper into one of these projects. I would like to say a little bit also about the hurdles that you had throughout the thesis, because when I talked to Arno, for instance, at one point he said, yeah, with Frauke everything is easy, right? And while this is true, also you had hurdles despite being a very smart and curious person during the thesis. So there were these external hurdles. Peter mentioned COVID, also the restructuring process of the department where you were to some degree involved. You had some internal hurdles about do you want to stay in academia or not. moving around to different places. Then you also had some hurdles imposed on you by the supervisors. Yeah, by one supervisor who requested extra treatments when you didn't really want to run extra treatments. Another supervisor who came up with a research idea which was maybe a bit more difficult than he thought it would be. So you had to handle quite a few challenges, but I think in the end this makes it even more sweet to finish the thesis, and you should really be proud of that and take your time to celebrate that. I also want to echo Peter in what he said about your impact on us. I mean, I think you made a lot of lasting friendships here. You see people like Yasmin, like Henrik, who come to this defense, yeah, who take the days off to make it here just to watch you, Evelyn as well, and David's still here, but yeah, so you made a lot of friends here, and I think everybody has only nice words to say about your personality. You also had an impact on us, so we now think a bit more about environmental consciousness, and we have also developed a bit more of a thoughtful attitude towards diversity and topics on that, and I really enjoyed discussing these topics with you throughout the thesis process. I think Peter mentioned a lot of the other things I wanted to say about the span of topics that you had. Arno and Stefan also said that already, that it's really difficult to perform so well in this range of different topics. And today we also saw that you're a very, very serious researcher, and I have a very good feeling about your next step in academia. I wish you that you find also something which interests you and where you really have the drive, because I think when you really have the drive, then this is where you really excel in terms of producing output. So yeah, I wish you all the best for the next step in academia, and congratulations again for the nice thesis in defense.
Thank you.
Dear Dr. Stehr, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you, your family, your friends, your supervisors with the degree you have acquired. I would like to thank the members of the degree committee, and I would like to give those two members of the degree committee who are still online an opportunity to congratulate you shortly. So, Dr. Brozig-Koch.
Thank you very much. As I said, I very much enjoyed reading your PhD thesis, and I'm very glad to have had the opportunity to read the thesis. It's a very nice thesis that combines different methods that we have in economics. So very warm congratulations also from my side, and I wish you all the best for your future in Vienna.
Thank you.
Dr. Friedrichsen. Dr. Friedrichsen. Professor Friedrichsen.
Dear Frauke, congratulations very much. It was my pleasure to read your thesis and be part of the committee and your defense here. I just want to keep it brief. I hope we'll see each other soon in Berlin, and I'm looking forward to discussing your future research ideas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. With this, I would like to conclude and close this session. We will take a picture at the stairway in the larger hall, and you're so kind to offer drinks to all those who came to see your success here in this auditorium. With this, I close this session.
Do you want to take my phone? Yeah.